Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to make sure that we kept on track with what we needed to cover, so I recorded this lecture so that we did complete some information today. So, going back and looking at some of the things we've already talked about, one of the last things I think we put in our notes before the juvenile unit was what is the purpose of law? And we talked about how the main purpose of law right now is that we protect. Um, it is most important that government is there so that individuals, property, institutions, and values can be protected. And so, what I'm going to go forward with today is I'm going to um, start moving forward. Let's see, we've covered the difference between national, state, and city laws and how we refer to them as act, statute, and ordinance. We've talked about vague laws and no laws and what society looks like if we have no laws and the conflict we have when the laws are vague and up for interpretation. What I'm going to cover today is the difference between two categories of crimes, and those are the violent and the property crimes. So moving forward on that, um, we're going to break this down into two categories. Now, you will be asked to know this list, and probably Friday, if not Monday, I will be giving you a quiz. Let me just pull that up for you. The quiz will look something like this, where obviously you give me your name and you will list the 5 categories of violent crime, and then you will list the 4 categories of property crime from memory. And so I just want you to know going into this that this is one of the things that we will be covering and I will be expecting is that as I go through these, we'll practice them, but I want to make sure you know that there is an expectation as a summative that you will have to list these property crimes going forward and these violent crimes. So going back to the lecture, um, when we look at violent crimes, and these are things I want to make sure you get in your notes, we're looking at crimes that are against a person. And so we're going to quickly look at the 5 main categories of those violent crimes. And then I'm going to reference back to the Minnesota statute so that you're able to see where in Minnesota law these are referenced. So we'll get started here. And so the first category that I want to reference here is the category of assault. Now, if we go in and we look at what the Minnesota statute says on assault, crimes against a person is the category. And if we look at Minnesota statute, there's our 609s again. We have first, second, third, fourth, and fifth degree assault. So first degree assault is the highest level. And one of the things that I want you to get down in your notes is that first degree assault is one that has great bodily harm. Now, when you look at another level of assault, they're going to talk about substantial bodily harm. But the great bodily harm that they're referencing here in first degree assault in Minnesota, this is something that is probably permanent injury. A number of years ago, we had an assault of a young man in Mankato, and he ended up getting pushed on the ground and they kicked him in the head to the point that he has permanent brain damage. And so when they arrested the person and charged the person, he was charged with first degree assault because of the great bodily harm. In Minnesota, we're looking at a sentence of not more than 20 years and up to a $30,000 fine. So Minnesota doesn't really play around with the assault. Second degree assault is when there is a weapon involved. And so somebody could injure someone permanently, and they did so with the use of a baseball bat or a gun or a crowbar or some other object that they used as a weapon, and they could be charged then with second-degree assault in addition to the first-degree assault. So third-degree assault is where we see things change a little bit. This is the substantial bodily harm. So first-degree assault was something that the person is going to be affected with very likely the rest of their life. Substantial bodily harm is someone who is injured, but it may be healed. They may resume their life without any complications or permanent injury. But you see what ends up happening here is that there could be up to 5 years imprisonment and possibly a $10,000 fine or both. So again, Minnesota takes that very seriously. Fourth degree assault is when we start looking at a peace officer. That is the technical legal term of a police officer. Assaulting a firefighter or an EMT. Assaulting someone who works for the DNR. Correction employees, judges, probation officers. So we have an entire category of assault that protects those that are choosing to work with the public in terms of law enforcement or ambulance services or firefighters. Fifth degree assault is unique because it looks at a number of different levels, but I think what I want to point out to you most is that in fifth degree assault, you can be charged with assault and never actually touch the person. So commits an act with intent to cause fear or inflicts or attempts to inflict bodily harm. And there Minnesota's famous word is or. So there are cases of students that I've worked with who have been charged with fifth degree assault, and they never laid a hand on a person. They just threatened the person and ended up being charged with assault. So we look at the categories. Again, here's your first one. The second category that I want you to add onto the violent crimes list is aggravated assault. And I will type that here for those of you that want me to make sure you get the spelling for that. So when we look at aggravated assault, the term aggravated simply means a weapon was involved. So we see the difference in the two pictures. Whoops, let me get that out of the way. Using a fist to injure someone versus using an object to injure someone. So we have two categories in the violent crime category, assault and aggravated assault. And I want you to know that when you see that term aggravated, that simply is implying or saying to us that a weapon was used. And so when we look at the 609 code, they will talk about second degree assault is that in which there's a weapon used. So that's actually considered a violent crime category. Another category that falls under the violent crimes is robbery. Okay, so that is our third category. Now let me go to the 609 and pull up robbery, and so that we can look at what that is. See, if you look on the board, you see that we have simple robbery and aggravated robbery. So there's actually two types of robbery within that category. So this is considered a violent crime for this reason right here, is that somebody is taking something off of a person, or they're using force to take something from a person. That is different than theft, which we'll talk about in the violent crime category. So simple robbery, and then we have the aggravated robbery, which is when we are using a dangerous weapon. There's that term again. So When we look at the three that we've gone through so far, we've had assault, aggravated assault, and robbery. Okay, not all cases of robbery are necessarily where a weapon is involved. So we're just calling it the robbery category. So if I were to add a page in here and we were to make sure that our list is correct, violent crimes, your first category, and I'm going to make sure that everybody has this, is assault. Then we have aggravated assault, and I want to make sure everybody has this. And then our third category is robbery. So then our fourth category are, whoops, let me find my little cursor here. And that one's not going to work for me as well as I'd hoped it to, so we got to bring that out front. Is the category of homicide. So if I go forward and I type this in, our fourth category is homicide. Now, homicide has a whole bunch of specific crimes included. So when we go back to our 609 page and we start looking at the homicides, right here's the category. So that's the whole category. So homicide includes 3 different levels of murder. It includes 2 different levels of manslaughter. And it also brings into play the vehicular homicide, which is the use of a vehicle to take someone's life. And then for some reason, people are confused about this, but we have the 609 code regarding suicide. And so in Minnesota, aiding someone into a suicide or aiding someone into attempting suicide is a crime in Minnesota. And when you look at aiding someone, that's not a small crime there. In addition to actually aiding someone into attempting. We've had cases that I've covered in years past where that's a form of bullying, where we have cases of kids cyberbullying and telling kids to take their own lives. And then the parents are very surprised when the kids are arrested for encouraging someone to take their own life because it is a crime. Again, Minnesota looks into this and makes sure that this is an area where people are protected as well. So we're looking at the 4. The 5th one, and I'll show you the picture first, and I want students to understand this was not an easy one to find a picture of, because this one is a category that is very personal to a number of people, and I don't take this category lightly. These are sex crimes. Now, I'm going to give you, and you will have to make sure you know this correctly. This is known as criminal, sexual conduct. Now, Minnesota looks at criminal sexual conduct and does not refer to it strictly as rape. And so I'm going to go to the 609 and I'm going to find the ones that are here. So we have obviously sex and labor trafficking crimes, but we have a whole category of sex crimes. And the ones that I want to focus on are these 5 levels, 5 degrees of criminal sexual conduct. So if you just scan this list, you will not, to my knowledge, I've never seen it, you'll never see the word rape, because Minnesota does not use that in their terminology. And so when we look at the different levels of criminal sexual conduct in Minnesota, there are a couple of factors that differentiate between the two. Criminal sexual conduct 1 and 3 actually deal with sexual penetration of another person. And there's a lot of different circumstances in which this happens. Criminal sexual conduct 2 and 4 are a person who engages in sexual contact, but it doesn't necessarily imply that there was sexual penetration. So there is a difference between those. I don't go into this very in depth because I think it's one that needs to be treated with a little bit of respect and understanding that some students may struggle with this. So I don't go into it as in depth as I could, and that is just by personal choice. So when we go back and we look, those are the 5 categories of violent crimes that you're going to have to be able to write down on this list when we take this quiz. The second category are the property crimes. These are crimes that are against somebody's object, like their home, their car, things they own. This is not necessarily a crime in which there's an actual victim per se, that the crime is done against an individual. It's done more against one's property. So when we look at the 4 different categories in this one, and I will make another slide here so that we have the ability to have this as well. Property crimes. Again, I said there are 4 of them. So the first one we'll go through. Let me just pull this up. Whoops. Let me get that pulled up. Is burglary. And I will write that for you here so that it is spelled correctly. Nope, that's not what I wanted it to do. My apologies. Let me get to where I need it to be. I will drop it down one, and we'll just go with burglary. Hoping that's spelled right. So let's take a peek at the 609 and see what the 609 is telling us about private property crimes. Oops, I backed it up too far. All right, so we're going to scroll down through the crimes, and we're going to end up getting to, you're seeing a lot of different categories here, but we're going to get to this part that talks about theft-related crimes. We'll get into that here in a second. Damage or trespassing. Where's my burglary? Let me go find, and I'm struggling. There we go. It's under the damage and trespassing. Okay, so let's open up burglary and just see what burglary is referencing. Again, we have different degrees of burglary, so there's 4 degrees of burglary, but I think the thing that we need to understand about this, it's somebody who enters a building without consent. And we're talking about a permanent structure here. We're not talking about a fish house necessarily. Somebody's, well, obviously we're going to go into the category of cars here in a second, but we're looking at somebody who goes into a building, and imprisonment for first degree, I mean, we're looking at 20 years and possibly up to $35,000 in fines. So burglary, enters a building without consent, enters a building without consent. There's that same pattern for all 4 of them. So that is considered the first property crime I want you guys to remember. The second property crime, because we said burglary is based on fixed structures, we have the one that deals with motor vehicle theft. Motor vehicle theft, obviously, motor vehicles are not permanent fixed structures. So when we start to get into, let me look it up, and I got to find it. Vehicle, there it is. Nope, that's not the one I want. Let's go back up. There it is. Nope. Well, I'm missing this whole one. So if I go back into theft and related property crimes, I'm struggling here to find it. The law that is referencing even getting into a vehicle that is running. We had a case here in Minnesota where a guy was walking, and there was a car parked outside the front of a house, and they were just warming their car up, and the guy came and sat inside the car while it was running. Um, for whatever reason, I would just assume he was there because he wanted to warm up. He ends up getting in trouble for motor vehicle theft because he had the ability to leave with that vehicle, because once he's behind the wheel of the car, he is in possession of that. All right, so our third category then, going back to our pictures, here's our motor vehicle theft. Right now, the number one cars to steal are the Hyundais and the Kias because of the way the cars are turned on, and they're the number one cars being stolen right now. The third category, and I want to make sure, let's see, we're going to go, we're going to put this front. The third category, and I'm going to ask you to know it by the formal term, is larceny. Larceny is theft. Okay, and I'll just put that behind this so that you have an understanding of what we're referencing when we talk about larceny. So when we start to talk about theft, they're referencing it directly as theft. So in this case, I'm fine if you use either term because that is the term that's used in the 609. But the one thing I want you to get down is where it comes to theft, how much a person is charged and what level of theft they're referencing is based on the value of the item that's been stolen. So I just stole a ring. Okay, it was just this small little ring, but the ring's value was $2,000. That's going to be a higher level theft than I stole a box of candy. Okay, the box of candy is bigger than the ring. It doesn't matter. What they're looking at is they're looking at the value of what was stolen. So stealing a car is going to be a higher level theft than stealing lipstick from Walmart. Minnesota bases it completely on the value. Property, as they're looking at here, is all forms of tangible things that I can hold in my hand. My earbuds, my phone. These are things that I can hold in my hand, including pets. This is kind of gross because it talks about dead bodies, but that's a whole other category we're not going to get into. But it's things that I have to hold tangible. And so I want to make sure that when you're doing this one, you have that idea that that's what they're referencing. And the last category that we're going to reference, and I would hope that everybody knows this one, is arson. And I don't know why these are being so difficult, but our fourth category is arson. So if I go back in here, I'll just add that for you as well. So let's look at the 609 in reference to arson, and I know that that is very in-depth. We just passed it back here. We have 5 degrees of arson. If we look at the most extreme of them, the thing you need to remember when we're looking at arson is that it's by means of fire or explosive. Somebody is setting fire to something that doesn't belong to them. And so first degree is 20 years with the possibility of and or $20,000. So first degree goes into a lot of different levels. If we then go to second degree arson, there it is again, fire and explosives. And we can open them all up and it's going to say the same thing. Whoever by unlawful means uses fire or explosives, that's what this is referencing. So it's crazy to think of setting something on fire just because you want to destroy it. So again, we're looking at the five violent crime categories. Here they are again, if you want to just double check your list. And secondly, the property crimes. And so when we take the test, as I've said already, you will just be responsible to write down from memory those five violent crime categories and the five property crime categories. Now, what I want to finish up with today is I want to look at some crime statistics. And to do this, I've got a couple of sites that I want to share with you, looking at crime statistics, specifically Minnesota. So what we're looking at in fast facts here is that Minnesota violent crimes are on a sharp increase. Minnesota property crimes are stable for the last 3 years, and this is looking at data going as recent as 2021. Statewide increases in serious crime guided by trends in the Twin Cities. Okay, that's where our population is. And larceny and theft is our most common type of serious crime. People are stealing stuff. The other place I want to look is what is called the Uniform Crime Reporting, and that is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That's coming from the national level. And when I went into this, I pulled up the information, and I think it's very interesting in doing this is you can actually look by state. But for our purposes, I think the only reason we need to look here is Minnesota's. So when we look at the rate of violent crime in Minnesota for the past 12 years, well, this is looking at 9 years here because it's just going back to 2020, we see fluctuations. And where there were decreases, we can see the same decreases here in Minnesota. We have the ability in this to look specifically at homicides. So in 2021, there were 180 homicides. That is looking at the state level. We can go back to 2020 and we see that number is lower. And so we can actually pull up these charts of looking at what does the United States look like for homicides versus how Minnesota, there is an increase on both of them. Rape. And here they use the term rape. They don't use the term criminal sexual conduct. And these numbers are different. And part of the reason is the different ways in which we categorize this crime. The other thing I wanted to point out when we're looking at these charts, because if we're just looking at, I got to go back here. If we look at homicides and we see these numbers, this is based on every 100,000 people. So what this is, and I should have explained this before, it's not saying that we only had one homicide. What I like about this is it tells us in 2012, there was one homicide for every 1.8 Minnesotans. So that's pretty crazy. Where we're at now, for every 100,000 people that are in the state of Minnesota, in 2020, there were 3 homicides. That's what these numbers are saying to us. So if we get into robbery, for example, and we look at the United States versus Minnesota, and we go into 2020, for every 100,000 people in the United States, there were 74 robberies. In Minnesota, we weren't far behind the national average when it came to robberies in Minnesota. Here's our aggravated assault. This is much higher. In 2020, for every 100,000 people in the United States, there were 280 aggravated assaults. Whereas in Minnesota, that's still a high number. For every 100,000 people in Minnesota, we had 166 aggravated assaults. So even though they're lower by population, they're still there. When we look at property crimes, there's that decrease, and we heard that, except we're looking here. The United States in 2020, and could this have been COVID? It very well could have been. We had a flip in terms of the national average. I always find it interesting to look at the arson. This is an interesting one because for every 100,000 people in the United States, there were 13 arsons. For every 100,000 people in Minnesota, there were also 13 arsons. So it is crazy. Here's that motor vehicle theft. Look at the numbers. They're just insane. They're just continually going up. I am actually going to ask the sub to play a video on motor vehicle thefts in Minnesota, just to give you an idea of what the situation is with the motor vehicles. And then we'll just look at a couple more here just to get an idea. I don't know, did we look at burglaries? There's back to 2010, Minnesota had a burglary for every 459 people in 100,000. We were having burglaries, whereas today we are down to 307. Why? There's a lot of factors that can go into this. I think part of the reason, me personally thinking this, is that we have more technology when people are coming into homes. And so it's easier to identify people coming into homes. And then larceny. This is stealing. And again, it's by every 100,000 people. Minnesota has a higher rate of theft than we do nationally. So we get a chance, and this is based on FBI statistics. So I think it's important to make sure we know that. Comparatively, I think this is also interesting when we look at this homicide offenders versus victims. 103 of the homicides in 2021 were by 20 to 29-year-old offenders. 39 were juveniles. Then we look over at who were the offenders or who were the victims, and we see that 21 of them were juveniles. So our highest age group of victims and homicides in 2021 in Minnesota was 62. So I think it's important that not only do we know these categories, but we have some knowledge of what Minnesota statistics look like as well. On the next day in class, we're going to look at what cities more specifically have these high crime rates, whether it's property crimes or violent crimes. There's statistics out there that we can see which are the most dangerous cities in the United States based on, and the key in this one is based on every 100,000 people. So we'll talk about that in class. And in our next time we meet. So I will post this video, so if you miss some information, you're able to go back and look. But what I'm going to ask our sub to do next is share a video with you about the motor vehicle thefts in Minnesota and why certain brands of vehicles are more targeted than others. So hope you were able to take notes and I wasn't too confusing, and we will talk to you soon.